Picture this. You are a Mongol scout in the dead of winter, 1285. The wind howling through the Carpathian mountains feels like shattered glass dragging across your face. You have survived the endless steppes. You have slaughtered entire cities, and you ride for the Golden Horde, the most terrifying war machine on the face of the earth. But right now, your fingers are so numb you cannot even notch an arrow. You push your starving pony forward through the blinding white, expecting to find the same helpless, unprotected Hungarian villages your grandfathers burned to ash 40 years ago. Instead, the blizzard clears for a fraction of a second, and a shadow looms over you. It is not a wooden palisade, it is a sheer, vertical cliff of solid stone rising out of nowhere, completely blocking the valley. Before you can even turn your horse around, a heavy crossbow bolt, thicker than your wrist, punches straight through your boiled leather armor and shatters your ribs. You fall into the snow bleeding out, staring up at a fortress that was not on any of your maps. You are the first to die, but you are about to be joined by 50,000 of your brothers. This is the Second Mongol Invasion of Hungary, the day the invincible horde rode straight into a medieval meat grinder and was wiped off the map. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the greatest conquerors in human history walked blindly into a slaughterhouse, we have to rewind the clock. We have to look at the psychology of a predator that has never known defeat and the desperation of a prey that refuses to be eaten twice. For decades, the Mongol Empire operated on a very simple, very brutal equation. They showed up, you surrendered, and you lived as a slave. If you resisted, they killed every man, woman, child, and dog inside your city limits, and they built a mountain out of your skulls to serve as a geographical landmark for the next town. It was a flawless system. It relied on speed, terror, and the absolute paralysis of their victims. In the mid-13th century, the entire world was caught in their teeth. The heavy knights of Europe, weighed down by their chainmail, and their arrogant delusions of chivalry were completely useless against the Mongol horse archers. The horde would feign a retreat, draw the heavy cavalry into the open mud, and turn them into pincushions from a distance. The armies of Poland and Hungary had been humiliated, butchered in massive open-field battles like Legnica and Mohi in 1241. The Mongols did not just beat the Europeans, they vivisected them. They treated European kings like slow, stupid cattle. So when Nogai Khan and Talabuga, the supreme commanders of the Golden Horde, ordered the invasion of Hungary in the winter of 1285, they were not planning a war, they were planning a harvest. They remembered the easy pickings of 1241. They remembered a flat country with defenseless villages, wide open plains perfect for their cavalry sweeps, and a panicked population that would run out into the snow to be hunted down for sport. They gathered an army of over 50,000 men, a tidal wave of flesh, bone, and composite bows ready to drown Eastern Europe in blood once again. But the Mongols suffered from the fatal disease of the undefeated. They suffered from arrogance. They believed the world was static. They thought that a nation, utterly broken 40 years prior, would still be crawling in the dirt, waiting to be stepped on. They did not realize that trauma is a master architect. They did not know that while the Golden Horde had spent the last 4 decades resting on its laurels and collecting tribute, the survivors in Hungary had been busy. They had stripped away their old military doctrine. They had weaponized their own paranoia. and they had turned their entire geography into an iron-jawed trap. The Mongols rode into the Carpathian Basin expecting a feast of frightened sheep. They did not realize the sheep had spent the last 40 years building a slaughterhouse specifically designed for wolves. To comprehend the sheer scale of the paranoia that gripped Hungary in the late 13th century, you have to look at the bleeding scars left behind by their first encounter with the horde. You have to rewind to the year 1241. The place was the Sajo River, specifically a blood-soaked patch of earth known to history as the Battle of Mohi. But calling Mohi a battle is a historical courtesy. It was not a battle, it was a mechanized culling. It was the day the European concept of warfare, built on chivalry, heavy armor, and honorable melee, was dragged into the mud and executed by an enemy that did not care about your noble bloodline. King Bela IV of Hungary had marched out to meet the forces of Batu Khan and Subutai with the absolute flower of European nobility at his back. He brought tens of thousands of men, confident that God and steel were on his side. He pitched his camp on a plain, surrounded his army with a ring of heavy wagons, and waited for the eastern barbarians to break themselves against his formidable defenses. He fundamentally misunderstood the predator he was dealing with. Subutai, arguably the greatest tactical genius in the Mongol war machine, did not throw his men at the wagons. He brought up siege engines. He bombarded the crowded, densely packed European camp with explosive weapons, naphtha, and an unceasing, suffocating rain of armor-piercing arrows. When the panic inside the Hungarian camp reached a boiling point, the Mongols deliberately left a gap in their encirclement. It looked like an escape route. It was actually a psychological pressure valve designed to break the Hungarian formation. The moment the European knights and infantry broke rank and bolted for the open gap, the trap snapped shut. The Mongols hunted them down over a stretch of 30 miles. You have to imagine the sheer, agonizing indignity of it. Knights who had trained their entire lives for glorious hand-to-hand combat died without ever swinging their swords, their lungs pierced by arrows fired from 100 yards away. Men were shot in the back, trampled into the earth, and driven into the swamps to drown under the weight of their own chainmail. The Hungarian army was not just defeated, it was systematically erased. The highest-ranking nobles were left rotting in the sun, stripped of their gold and their dignity. King Bela only survived by the skin of his teeth, fleeing like a hunted animal across his own burning kingdom, eventually abandoning the mainland entirely to hide on a tiny island in the Adriatic Sea just to stay out of reach of the Mongol horses. In the aftermath of Mohi, the Golden Horde unleashed a localized apocalypse on the defenseless Hungarian populace. They did not just loot, they exterminated. For a year, the Mongols roamed the plains, burning the wooden palisades of towns, torching the crops and massacring anyone they could catch. Wolves and wild dogs grew fat on the corpses of peasants and aristocrats alike. The winter that followed saw survivors freezing in the deep forests, reduced to eating bark and even resorting to cannibalism just to see another sunrise. It is estimated that up to a quarter of the entire Hungarian population was wiped off the census in a matter of months. Entire regions were depopulated, left as smoking craters of ash and mass graves. The Mongols only left in 1242 because of a political crisis back in their homeland, not because they were pushed out. When Bela IV finally returned to his capital, he did not find a kingdom. He found a massive graveyard. The trauma of that realization fundamentally broke the old Hungarian psyche. The king walked through the charred remains of his cities and realized a terrifying truth. The Mongols were not gone. They were just busy. They would return. And when they did, the traditional European way of war would mean absolutely nothing. A man on a heavy horse with a lance was just a slow target for a horse archer who could shoot backward while riding at a full gallop. The Mongol composite bow, engineered from horn, wood, and sinew, was the medieval equivalent of a sniper rifle. It punched through chainmail like wet paper. This collective trauma burned a singular, desperate obsession into the mind of the king. The realization was brutal but simple. If they remained the same, they would go extinct. Every nightmare the Hungarian people had featured the thundering hooves of the Mongol vanguard. They knew the countdown had started the moment the horde rode east. This national post-traumatic stress did not paralyze them. Instead, it fueled a radical, ruthless transformation. They had to evolve, and they had to do it before the horizon darkened with dust once again. King Bela IV did not return to his throne as a conqueror. He crawled back as a man who had looked the devil in the eye and barely escaped with his skin. When he surveyed the smouldering ruins of his kingdom in 1242, he didn't just see a tragedy. He saw a glaring, fatal flaw in the European defense matrix. The Mongols had burned through wooden palisades, earthworks, and open-field infantry formations like a blowtorch through dry paper. They had made an absolute mockery of traditional medieval warfare. But amid the ashes and the mass graves, Bela noticed one detail that would change the course of history. There was exactly one thing the Golden Horde had failed to destroy: solid stone. During the apocalyptic invasion, a tiny handful of stone fortresses, like the citadel of Esztergom, had actually withstood the Mongol onslaught. The horse archers, for all their terrifying speed and armor-piercing lethality in the open field, were remarkably inept at reducing solid rock. Without a massive imported siege train from China or Persia, a Mongol army staring at a stone wall was just a group of angry men on starving horses. This realization triggered a psychological shift in the king. It became a frantic national obsession. Bela looked at his bleeding, depopulated country and decided to turn the entire Carpathian Basin into a medieval panic room. He instituted what military historians recognize as one of the most drastic, scorched earth infrastructure overhauls in European history. He issued a decree that would physically alter the topography of his nation. He ordered the construction of stone castles, not just one or two along the border, but dozens, then hundreds. He gave away vast tracts of royal land to barons, bishops, and local warlords, but he attached one non-negotiable blood-iron condition: they had to build castles of stone. If you wanted to hold land in Bela's new Hungary, you had to build a fortress that could survive the end of the world. To fund this paranoid architectural frenzy, Bela nearly bankrupted the crown. He wasn't building a kingdom anymore, he was building a meat grinder. He forced the entire economy to pivot toward quarrying, transporting, and stacking limestone. You have to picture the sheer, grim desperation of this era. Men who had lost their entire families to the Mongol composite bow were now hauling massive stone blocks up the steepest, most inaccessible cliffs they could find. They didn't build these castles in convenient, comfortable locations. They built them on top of jagged crags overlooking narrow valleys and river crossings. They created deliberate choke points that would force any invading cavalry to dismount, abandon their mobility, and fight uphill in the mud. The aesthetic of these new fortresses did not matter. There were no grand ballrooms, no delicate tapestries, and no comfortable living quarters. These were brutal, ugly, highly functional blocks of pure defiance. They were designed for one purpose: to bleed the enemy dry. By the time the Golden Horde decided to return 4 decades later, the landscape of Hungary was completely unrecognizable. It had sprouted teeth. Over 100 new stone castles jutted out of the earth, creating an interlocking network of impenetrable strongholds. But Bela was not a fool. He knew that walls alone do not kill the enemy. A castle is just a stone tomb if the men standing on the battlements do not possess the capacity for extreme violence. The king understood that the old way of fighting, the glorious chivalric cavalry charge, was a suicide pact against the Mongols. So, while he was reshaping the mountains, he was also altering the very DNA of his military. He was preparing an entirely new breed of killer to garrison these fortresses. The stone was just the anvil. Bela was about to forge the hammer, and it would be made of heavy iron and high-tension steel. Stone is fantastic for not dying, but it is terrible for killing. King Bela IV understood a fundamental law of physics. A wall is just a shield, and a shield without a sword is just a delayed execution. The Mongols could theoretically sit outside these new fortresses for years, burning the countryside and starving the defenders out. To actually break the horde, the Hungarians needed a weapon that could project extreme, lethal force. They needed to mutate their military DNA. For centuries, the traditional Hungarian army had looked a lot like the Mongols. They relied on light cavalry, skirmishers, and horse archers. They fought a war of mobility and harassment. But in 1241, they learned a fatal lesson. You cannot out-Mongol the Mongols. Engaging the Golden Horde in a shooting match on the open plains was like bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight. The eastern invaders were faster, they shot further, and they had been perfecting their lethal geometry since childhood. Bela realized that trying to match their speed was a suicide pact. So he decided to do the exact opposite. He traded speed for mass, and he traded mobility for sheer, unstoppable kinetic energy. He opened his borders and invited the heavy hitters of Western Europe. He offered massive land grants to military orders like the Knights Hospitaller, and he hired heavily armored German mercenaries. He essentially imported an entirely new breed of apex predator. These were men encased in interlocking rings of steel, riding massive war horses that were bred to trample infantry into pulp. They were slow, yes, but once they gained momentum, a charge of heavy knights was a medieval freight train. If they could catch the light Mongol cavalry in a tight space, say a narrow valley overlooked by a new stone castle, they would crush the invaders like insects. But heavy cavalry alone was not enough. You still had to deal with the Mongol composite bow, the sniper rifle of the 13th century. To counter it, Bela championed a weapon that stripped all the skill and romance out of archery: the crossbow. To shoot a Mongol composite bow effectively, you needed to train every day from the time you were 5 years old. To shoot a medieval crossbow, you just needed a few weeks of practice, a mechanical winch, and a clear line of sight. The crossbow was a brutal, ugly, unchivalric machine. It was so terrifyingly effective that the Pope had previously tried to ban it from being used against other Christians. But Bela was not fighting Christians, he was fighting the apocalypse, and he needed every armor-piercing advantage he could get. A heavy crossbow bolt fired from the battlements of a high stone wall did not care how fast a Mongol horse could run. It did not care about the invader's lifetime of training on the steppes. It hit with enough localized force to punch straight through boiled leather, shatter a man's ribcage, and pin him to his saddle. By heavily integrating crossbowmen into his garrisons, Bela transformed his castles from passive hiding spots into active kill zones. Any Mongol army attempting to approach these fortresses would be subjected to a relentless mechanized rain of heavy iron bolts, and if the invaders tried to fall back or disorganize their lines to avoid the sniper fire, the gates would open, and the heavy iron knights would pour out to finish the job in close quarters. By the time Bela passed away and the late 1280s approached, the transformation was complete. Hungary was no longer the soft, vulnerable underbelly of Europe. It was a bristling, iron-plated trap. The nation had weaponized its own trauma, creating a hybrid war machine perfectly engineered to counter the exact tactics that had destroyed them 40 years earlier. They had the anvil of stone and the hammer of heavy steel. All they needed now was the enemy. And right on cue, the Golden Horde, completely blind to the fact that the rules of the game had changed, began to march west. Nogai Khan was not a man who entertained the concept of failure. He was the undisputed kingmaker of the Golden Horde, a warlord so terrifying that the princes of Eastern Europe literally crawled on their hands and knees just to kiss his stirrups. When he and his co-commander Talabuga decided to invade Hungary in the winter of 1285, they did not hold long, anxious war councils to debate the tactical prowess of the enemy. You do not hold a strategic war council to plan how to butcher a pig. You just sharpen your knife and walk into the pen. The Mongol war machine that massed on the eastern borders of the Carpathian Mountains was a breathtaking, horrifying spectacle. Tens of thousands of seasoned horse archers, hardened by the brutal winters of the Eurasian steppe, gathered under the yak-tail banners. They were a predatory superorganism, a swarm of locusts armed with composite bows. But underneath all that terrifying discipline, there was a rot eating away at the core of the army. It was not a physical disease, it was the psychological poison of absolute supremacy. The Mongols had spent the last 40 years believing their own mythology. They believed that European armies were nothing more than slow, stupid targets wrapped in tin foil, waiting to be pincushioned from a distance. This supreme arrogance birthed the single most catastrophic logistical error in Mongol history. Because Nogai and Talabuga viewed the upcoming campaign as a high-speed slave raid rather than a grueling conquest, they completely altered their loadout. In the original invasion of 1241, the legendary General Subutai had brought along a massive contingent of Chinese and Persian siege engineers. He brought traction trebuchets, heavy ballistas, and the medieval equivalent of explosive artillery. He knew that to break a nation, you had to be able to break its infrastructure. Nogai looked at that slow, heavy, cumbersome siege train and scoffed. Why drag massive wooden catapults across the freezing mountains just to knock down a few mud and wood peasant palisades? Siege equipment slowed the horde down. It ruined their greatest advantage, speed. So the supreme commanders made a fatal choice. They left the siege engineers behind. They packed light. They brought extra arrows, empty saddlebags for the looted silver, and miles of rope to tie up the human cattle they planned to drag back to the slave markets of Crimea. They brought an army perfectly designed to annihilate an enemy on a flat, open field. They did not bring a single tool capable of cracking solid stone. As the Golden Horde began its ascent into the jagged, snow-choked passes of the Carpathian Mountains, they were riding high on a wave of bloodthirsty optimism. The conditions were atrocious. The wind howled through the narrowed defiles, freezing the breath in their lungs. But the Mongols were born in the ice. They sustained themselves by opening small veins in the necks of their horses and drinking the warm blood mixed with mare's milk. They pushed through the blizzards with the relentless mechanical determination of an apex predator closing in on a wounded animal. They expected the journey through the mountains to be the hardest part of the campaign. They genuinely believed that once they crested the final peaks and looked down into the Hungarian Basin, the real fun would begin. They anticipated the familiar, comforting sight of unprotected villages, sprawling manors, and a panicked, disorganized militia stumbling out into the mud to be slaughtered. But as the vanguard of the Golden Horde finally rode out of the freezing mountain passes and descended into the Hungarian heartland, the cheering stopped. The bloodthirsty anticipation dissolved into a creeping, icy confusion. As they looked out over the vast plains they had terrorized 40 years earlier, they did not see smoke rising from vulnerable towns. They did not see peasants fleeing in terror. In fact, they did not see anyone at all. The landscape was entirely empty. The trap was set, the door of the slaughterhouse had just clicked shut behind them, and the Mongols were about to discover exactly what King Bela had been building in the dark. When the Golden Horde finally descended from the freezing altitudes of the Carpathian Mountains, they were hungry. But for a Mongol army, hunger was usually a temporary inconvenience quickly solved by extreme violence. They fanned out across the Hungarian plains, their horse archers practically salivating at the prospect of finding the first, fat, unprotected village. They rode toward the coordinates where thriving settlements had stood 40 years ago. But when they arrived, they didn't find helpless peasants or panicked militias. They found absolute, terrifying silence. The villages were gone, not just abandoned, but intentionally, clinically erased. The fields had been burned to black ash. The wells had been poisoned or filled with rocks. The livestock had vanished. The Mongols had ridden into a country that had essentially committed economic suicide just to spite them. This was the first phase of King Bela's scorched earth welcome, and it revealed a horrifying psychological mutation in the Hungarian people. In 1241, when the first invasion hit, the rural population acted exactly how you would expect normal medieval farmers to act. They panicked. They gathered whatever belongings they could carry, ran blindly into the swamps and deep forests, and huddled in the mud, waiting to be hunted down like terrified deer. But trauma changes the DNA of a nation. The generation that survived the first apocalypse raised their children with a singular, icy truth: running will get you killed. So when the warning bells rang in the winter of 1285, the peasants did not panic. They executed a perfectly choreographed nationwide disappearing act. They took every kernel of grain, every strip of dried meat, and every drop of drinkable water, and they walked up the steep, jagged hills into the new stone fortresses. They pulled up the drawbridges, locked the heavy iron-reinforced oak doors, and looked down at the plains below. The people of Hungary had stopped being victims. They had evolved into something much colder. They had weaponized their own landscape, and they had become just as ruthless as the men hunting them. Down on the plains, the situation for the Golden Horde was rapidly deteriorating from a glorious conquest into a localized famine. The Mongol military machine was a biological engine, and it ran on a very specific fuel, the calories of the conquered. Each Mongol soldier brought several horses, rotating them to maintain their terrifying speed. But horses need grass, and in the dead of winter on a burned-out plain, there is nothing but freezing mud. The famous Mongol logistics system, which relied entirely on living off the land, simply collapsed because the land was dead. And the peasants didn't just hide. The ones who stayed outside the castles, specifically the local militias and the fierce border guards known as the sekulis, began a relentless campaign of psychological and physical harassment. They knew the terrain intimately. They knew every narrow ravine, every frozen river crossing, and every blind corner in the valleys. They didn't fight the Mongols in an open battle. Instead, they waited for small, desperate foraging parties to wander into the narrow defiles in search of food. Then they dropped boulders from the cliffs, fired heavy crossbow bolts from the tree line, and vanished back into the snow before the starving invaders could even draw their bows. The Golden Horde had spent decades terrifying the world, but in the valleys of the Carpathians, they were the ones jumping at shadows. The mighty conquerors were being bled out by farmers, by men who had traded their plows for iron bolts and an ancestral grudge. The hunters had walked straight into a cage, and for the first time in their history, they were looking through the bars at a prey that was smiling back at them. The starvation was setting in. And here is the brutal reality of steppe warfare. A Mongol without a horse is not a terrifying cavalryman. He is just a freezing man in a leather coat standing in a country that hates him. The great war machine was grinding to a halt, completely out of fuel, right at the foot of the impregnable stone walls they now had to somehow break. By the time the main body of the Golden Horde reached the city of Pest, the desperation was palpable. Pest had been one of the crown jewels of their previous conquest in 1241. Back then, it was a sprawling, prosperous settlement protected by wooden palisades. The Mongols had simply set it on fire, waited for the inhabitants to run out screaming, and cut them down. Nogai Khan rode toward the city, expecting a repeat performance. He expected to warm his freezing, starving army by the light of a burning city. But as the smoke from their own campfires cleared, the Mongols were greeted by a nightmare in grey. Pest was no longer a city of wood, it was a fortress of solid stone. King Bela's paranoia had transformed the settlement into an impenetrable monolith. The wooden palisades were gone, replaced by thick, towering curtain walls that seemed to mock the exhausted invaders. You have to understand the specific type of panic that sets in when a military superpower realizes its only weapon is completely useless. The Mongol composite bow was an engineering marvel, capable of driving a shaft through a man at 200 yards. But a bow, no matter how perfectly crafted from horn and sinew, cannot bleed a rock. The Golden Horde had brought no catapults, no trebuchets, and no siege towers. They had brought light cavalry to a heavy siege. Nogai Khan, blinded by his own arrogance and the mounting starvation of his men, ordered an attack anyway. What followed was not a battle. It was an exercise in absolute futility. Tens of thousands of the greatest horse archers in the world rode in circles around the stone walls, unleashing a torrential downpour of arrows. The sky went dark. The thrum of the bowstring sounded like a hurricane. Hundreds of thousands of arrows struck the walls of Pest, and the walls did absolutely nothing. The arrows shattered against the limestone, splintering into useless fragments of wood and iron. The Mongols were literally throwing their ammunition away against a target that could not feel pain. Inside the walls, the Hungarians did not even bother to duck. They stood on the battlements perfectly protected by heavy stone crenellations and watched the supposed conquerors of the world exhaust themselves. And then the Hungarians began to fire back. But they were not using bows, they were using heavy crossbows. The mechanics of a siege had been completely inverted. Usually the besiegers starve out the defenders. Here the defenders were warm, well-fed, and armed with armor-piercing artillery, while the besiegers were freezing, starving in the mud, and sitting on dying horses. The click of a Hungarian crossbow winch became the soundtrack of the Mongol nightmare. A heavy iron bolt would snap down from the high walls, traveling with so much kinetic energy that it would punch through a Mongol rider, pass through his saddle, and bury itself in his horse. There was no defense. There was no counterattack. The Mongols could not shoot high enough to hit the snipers, and they could not break the walls to stop them. For days, the Golden Horde sat outside the walls of Pest, bleeding out from 1,000 tiny cuts. Disease began to spread through their unsanitary camps. The horses, having eaten every blade of dead grass within 10 miles, began to drop dead from starvation, and in a final, brutal twist of irony, the starving Mongols were forced to eat their own dying mounts, the very animals that had made them the fastest, deadliest army on earth. They were consuming their own mobility just to survive the week. Nogai Khan stared at the unyielding stone of Pest and realized a cold, horrifying truth. The siege was over and they had lost. But the nightmare was just beginning, because while the Mongols had been breaking their teeth against the stone, the heavy iron doors of the Hungarian castles across the country were preparing to open. The Mongols, sitting outside the fortresses of Hungary in the winter of 1285, thought they had reached the absolute bottom of hell. They were freezing to death in the mud, butchering their own dying horses for sustenance, and being systematically picked off by heavy crossbows from walls they couldn't even scratch. But they were about to learn a terrifying lesson about medieval engineering. King Bela's castles were not just static panic rooms designed to keep the monsters out. They were holding pens specifically designed to keep the monsters perfectly distracted while the real executioners saddled up. For weeks, while the Golden Horde wasted their energy, their morale, and their ammunition against the unyielding limestone, a different kind of kinetic energy was building inside the castle courtyards. The heavy knights of Hungary, alongside heavily armoured German mercenaries and warrior monks, had been waiting in the dark. They had been sleeping by warm fires. They had been eating hot meals. Most importantly, their massive war horses had been resting in dry stables, eating oats and maintaining their explosive muscle mass, while the Mongol ponies starved in the snow outside. They were a tightly coiled spring of iron and flesh, waiting for the enemy to reach the point of maximum exhaustion. When the Hungarian commanders standing on the battlements looked down and saw that the legendary Mongol horde had disintegrated into a disorganized, shivering mob of scavengers, they finally gave the order. The heavy, iron-bound oak gates didn't just creak open, they dropped like the jaws of a trap snapping shut in reverse. What poured out of those gates wasn't just an army, it was an iron avalanche. Thousands of tons of heavily armoured cavalry thundered down the ramps and smashed straight into the bewildered, freezing Mongol camps. To comprehend the slaughter that followed, you have to understand the brutal, unforgiving physics of this collision. A Mongol steppe pony is a miracle of endurance, but it is relatively small, light, and was currently starving to death. A European destrier, bred specifically to carry a man in full chainmail and steel plating, is essentially a biological freight train. When that massive warhorse, travelling at 20 miles an hour, slammed into the stationary, exhausted Mongol lines, it didn't just knock men over, it shattered them. Horses and riders were trampled into the bloody snow, literally ground into paste beneath the iron-shod hooves of the Hungarian charge. The Mongols, acting on decades of ingrained instinct, tried to fall back on their ancestral tactics. They desperately tried to wheel their surviving horses around, open up the distance, and fire their bows to bleed the heavy cavalry. But they were trapped. Bela's castles had been deliberately constructed overlooking narrow valleys, tight river crossings, and steep ravines. There was no open steppe to retreat to. The Mongols were physically pinned against the unforgiving geography, and their starving horses simply did not have the explosive speed required to escape the momentum of the heavy knights. For the first time in their lives, the elite horse archers of the Golden Horde were forced into desperate, claustrophobic, hand-to-hand combat against men who were entirely encased in steel. The Mongol composite bow is a weapon of psychological dominance, allowing you to kill without ever being touched, but when a towering Hungarian knight is 2 feet away, swinging a heavy spiked mace at your skull, a bow is just a useless piece of wood. The curved sabers and light boiled leather armor of the Mongols were completely obsolete in this environment. It was an absolute butchery. The invincible warriors of the East, the men who had terrorized half the globe, were being physically dismantled by the slow, stupid European knights they had spent 40 years laughing at. Panic, a contagious and highly lethal disease, swept through the Mongol ranks. This was no longer a tactical retreat. It was a catastrophic, hysterical rout. The apex predators of the 13th century broke rank, abandoned their siege lines, and ran for their lives. The trap had been sprung, the hammer had slammed down on the anvil, and the mighty Golden Horde was currently being ground to dust. Nogai Khan and Talabuga were not men accustomed to the bitter taste of fear. For their entire lives, the word retreat was merely a tactical illusion, a clever feint used to drag arrogant European knights out of formation and into a slaughterhouse. But as they stared at the mangled, steel-crushed remains of their vanguard bleeding out in the freezing mud outside the Hungarian fortresses, the horrifying reality set in. This was no feint. The Golden Horde was not retreating to regroup. They were running for their biological survival. The supreme commanders swallowed decades of unblemished pride, turned their starving horses toward the east, and ordered a full-scale evacuation. But escaping King Bella's iron-jawed trap was going to be infinitely more agonizing than walking into it. When the Mongols had first crossed the Carpathian Mountains months earlier, they were a disciplined, synchronized organism of death. Now, as they approached the jagged foothills to flee, they were a frantic, shivering mob of scavengers about to try and climb a frozen wall. The winter of 1285 was merciless, and the passes were still choked with ice and snow. As the disorganized horde funneled themselves back into those narrow, suffocating defiles, the final phase of the Hungarian master plan was activated. The apex predators of the medieval world were about to learn exactly what it felt like to be hunted for sport. The local militias and the shekeli border guards, hardened, ruthless men who knew every blind corner, every unstable cliff face and every icy ravine, had been waiting in the high altitudes for weeks. They knew the Mongols had to come back this way. They did not form up in ranks or offer honorable combat. They simply let the brutal geography of the mountains serve as the anvil while they acted as the hammer. Imagine the sheer claustrophobic terror of that march. You are a Mongol veteran. Your boots are rotting off your feet. You are suffering from frostbite, dysentery, and severe malnutrition. You are physically dragging your dying horse through waist-deep snow up a steep, winding trail. The wind is screaming so loudly you cannot hear the orders of your officers, and then the cliff above you explodes. It is an artificial avalanche. Hundreds of massive boulders and deliberately felled timber rain down from the sky, triggered by unseen militiamen hiding in the clouds. Entire columns of the world's most feared cavalry are instantly pulverized, swept off the narrow ledges and sent tumbling into the black, jagged abysses below. For those who survived the crushing rocks, there was no sanctuary. The Sekelis stalked the retreating column day and night like phantoms. They poisoned the few unfrozen springs. They dug hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes in the natural choke points. From the impenetrable tree line, heavy crossbow bolts would suddenly snap through the freezing air, pinning Mongol officers to pine trees before the shooters vanished back into the blizzard. The Golden Horde was being subjected to a slow, methodical vivisection. The psychological toll broke the army completely. The iron discipline that had forged the largest contiguous empire in human history dissolved into raw, animalistic panic. The Mongols began to turn on each other over scraps of dead horse meat. They dumped the heavy sacks of silver and gold they had looted, realizing you cannot eat coins. They abandoned their wounded to freeze to death in the snowbanks. They slaughtered the thousands of Hungarian captives they had taken, too exhausted to drag them along, leaving a trail of butchered corpses to mark their pathetic exodus. Talabuga's contingent was almost completely erased from the earth. By the time his shattered forces managed to claw their way over the final peaks and stumble back onto the eastern steppes, they were barely recognizable as a military unit. They had lost their horses, their weapons, their aura of invincibility, and their minds. Historical chronicles record that Talabuga's surviving men were so utterly consumed by starvation and disease that they resorted to widespread cannibalism just to make it home. The great Mongol war machine had walked into the Carpathian meat grinder expecting a feast, and instead they ended up eating each other. When the spring thaw finally came to the Carpathian Mountains in 1286, the melting snow did not reveal the budding flowers of a new season. It revealed a horrifying monument to arrogance. Tens of thousands of Mongol corpses, perfectly preserved by the winter freeze, began to rot in the narrow passes. They were stripped of their armor, their weapons, and their dignity. The Second Mongol Invasion of Hungary did not end in a tactical withdrawal or a negotiated treaty. It ended in an absolute, humiliating extermination. The Golden Horde had marched west with over 50,000 men, expecting to harvest an entire nation. Barely a fraction of that number stumbled back onto the eastern steppes, and those who did were broken. Starving men who would spend the rest of their lives waking up in cold sweats, haunted by the mechanical click of a Hungarian crossbow. For the first time since Genghis Khan united the nomadic tribes and unleashed them upon the earth, the invincible aura of the Mongol war machine was irrevocably shattered in Europe. The myth of their absolute supremacy bled out in the mud of the Carpathian Basin. The rest of the continent looked on in stunned disbelief. The unstoppable force had finally met an immovable object, and the immovable object had ground it to dust. King Bela IV never lived to see his brutal masterpiece fully activated. He died in 1270, 15 years before the trap was sprung, but his paranoia, his relentless, unforgiving obsession with stacking limestone and forging iron, saved his country from erasure. He understood a fundamental truth about survival in a violent world. You cannot reason with a tidal wave. You can only build a breakwater. He completely re-engineered the DNA of his nation, transforming the soft, vulnerable plains of Hungary into a bristling, iron-plated fortress that tore the guts out of the greatest empire on earth. But this survival came at a terrifying psychological and environmental cost. To defeat the monsters of the steppe, the Hungarians had to become something equally ruthless. They had willingly burned their own fields to ash. They had poisoned their own wells. They had locked themselves in stone cages and watched their own countryside burn, abandoning all chivalry for the cold, calculated mechanics of a meat grinder. They won because they were willing to endure a localized apocalypse just to ensure their enemies starved to death in it. The legacy of 1285 is a dark, uncomfortable reminder of the physics of war. Speed, mobility, and terror are devastating weapons, but they are incredibly fragile. When arrogance blinds a military superpower, they stop adapting. When the Mongols' speed hit a solid wall of stone, and when their terror tactics were unleashed against a people who had already looked the apocalypse in the eye 40 years prior, the predator instantly became the prey. The Mongols rode into Hungary expecting to find the terrified, helpless victims of 1241. They died because they didn't realize that trauma does not always make a nation weak. Sometimes trauma just makes a nation infinitely more dangerous. If you survived this journey into one of history's most brutal tactical reversals, please verify your subscription and hit that like button. It is the absolute best way to help us continue uncovering these forgotten nightmares of the past. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you think King Bela's scorched earth strategy was a necessary stroke of genius, or was the deliberate destruction of his own countryside too high a price to pay for victory? I want to read your thoughts. If you want to see another instance of an unstoppable empire being broken by sheer discipline and heavy iron, click the video on your screen right now to dive into the blood-soaked sands of the Battle of Arsuf. Until next time, remember that history is not just a list of dates, it is a warning. I will see you in the next chapter.